the morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of New Haven City as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her binoculars, scanning the horizon from the fortified rooftop of the medical research facility. 3 months had passed since the viral outbreak transformed most of humanity into mindless, flesh-hungry creatures, and the remaining survivors had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded a massive zombie horde movement. Today those signs were everywhere. Commander Marcus Rodriguez joined her on the observation deck, his weathered face etched with concern as he studied the swirling patterns of smoke rising from the distant suburbs. The two had formed an unlikely partnership during the chaos. She, the brilliant virologist who had been working on a potential cure when the world collapsed, and he, the former military strategist who now led the largest surviving human settlement on the East Coast. They're moving in coordinated patterns again, Sarah observed, lowering her binoculars with a troubled expression. This isn't random migration. Something is organizing them. The implication sent a chill down Marcus's spine. In the early days of the outbreak, zombies had been predictable, slow, individual threats that could be managed with proper planning and firepower. But recently reports had been flooding in from other survivor settlements about organized zombie behavior, as if some form of collective intelligence had emerged from the infected masses. Marcus radioed down to the communications center, where Elena Vasquez, their head of intelligence, was coordinating with other survivor enclaves across the region. The radio crackled with urgent reports. Massive zombie congregations were forming simultaneously in 12 different cities, all moving toward strategic locations that had once been major transportation hubs. In the facility's underground laboratory, Dr. James Morrison worked feverishly alongside his small team of surviving researchers, analyzing blood samples from recently captured zombies. What they had discovered defied conventional understanding of the virus. The infected weren't just mindless anymore. Neural activity scans showed complex patterns suggesting a form of collective consciousness was emerging. It's as if they're becoming nodes in a vast network, James explained to Sarah during their brief morning meeting. Individual zombies are sacrificing themselves to gather information, which then gets transmitted to the collective through methods we don't fully understand yet. This revelation transformed everything the survivors thought they knew about their enemy. Meanwhile, in the settlement's main compound, ordinary people were becoming extraordinary heroes out of necessity. Maria Santos, a former school teacher, had become the settlement's most skilled scout, able to move through zombie-infested areas with ghost-like stealth. Her teenage son, David, had proven himself invaluable in maintaining their communications equipment and had developed innovative early warning systems using salvage technology. The settlement's defenders included Jake Thompson, a former construction worker whose knowledge of the city's infrastructure had saved lives countless times, and Rebecca Chong, a veterinarian who had become their primary medical officer when traditional doctors were unavailable. As the day progressed, the signs became impossible to ignore. The zombies weren't just gathering, they were preparing for something unprecedented. Drone surveillance footage showed massive hordes arranging themselves in formations that resembled military tactics, with smaller groups conducting what could only be described as reconnaissance missions. The infected had retained enough motor function and problem-solving ability to use basic tools, and some were even observed dismantling barriers and studying human defensive positions. The most disturbing discovery came when Elena's team intercepted strange low-frequency transmissions that seemed to originate from the zombie congregations themselves, a form of communication that suggested the infected were not just organized, but actively planning. The settlement's leadership convened an emergency council meeting as the sun began to set. Representatives from the various survivor groups, the medical team, the military remnants, the civilian population, and the technical specialists, gathered in the facility's main conference room. The evidence was overwhelming. Humanity faced not just a zombie apocalypse, but an evolving enemy that was becoming more sophisticated by the day. Sarah presented her latest research findings, suggesting that the virus was continuing to mutate, potentially developing into something that could pose an existential threat to the entire human species. Marcus outlined their defensive capabilities and the grim reality of their situation. They were outnumbered thousands to one with limited ammunition, supplies, and time. As darkness fell over New Haven City, the survivors made a crucial decision that would determine the fate of humanity. They would not wait for the zombie hordes to attack. Instead, they would take the fight to the infected, launching a desperate offensive aimed at disrupting whatever the zombies were planning. The mission would be incredibly dangerous, requiring every able-bodied survivor to participate in what might be humanity's final stand. But they had one advantage the zombies didn't know about. Sarah's research team had made a breakthrough that could potentially turn the tide of the entire conflict. The stage was set for an epic confrontation that would determine whether humanity would survive or join the ranks of the infected in a world where the dead had learned to think, plan, and fight back. The underground laboratory hummed with urgent activity as Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the computer screen displaying neural mapping data that defied everything she thought she knew about the infected. The breakthrough had come at 3 a.m. when her exhausted team noticed an anomaly in the brainwave patterns they'd been tracking from captured zombie specimens. James Morrison burst through the lab doors, his face pale with excitement and terror as he clutched a tablet containing satellite imagery that would change everything. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately," he gasped, his hands trembling as he pulled up thermal readings from the city's downtown district. What appeared on the screen was impossible yet undeniable, a massive heat signature concentrated in the abandoned Metropolitan Hospital, pulsing with rhythmic patterns that perfectly matched the neural frequencies they'd been detecting from individual zombies. Commander Rodriguez arrived within minutes of Sarah's emergency call, followed by Elena Vasquez and the other settlement leaders who had been awakened by the urgent summons. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying in its implications. The zombie collective wasn't just a network of connected minds, it had a physical nerve center, a biological command structure that was orchestrating the coordinated movements of hundreds of thousands of infected across the region. Sarah's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing as she explained how the virus had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. "It's not just connecting existing brain tissue," she said, pointing to the detailed scans. "It's creating new neural pathways, building something that functions like a massive distributed computer with this central processing unit at its core." The satellite feeds revealed the true horror of their situation. The Metropolitan Hospital had been transformed into something that resembled a living organism more than a building. Infected creatures moved in perfect synchronization around the structure, their movements following patterns that suggested they were serving as both guardians and components of a larger biological machine. Elena's intelligence reports from other survivor settlements painted an even grimmer picture. Similar central hubs were being detected in major cities across the continent, all of them showing the same pulsing energy signatures and coordinated zombie activity. The infected weren't just organized locally, they were building a continental network of control centers that could coordinate attacks across thousands of miles. Maria Santos returned from her latest reconnaissance mission with first-hand observations that confirmed their worst fears. She had witnessed infected creatures engaging in behaviors that went far beyond simple hunting or territorial instincts. Groups of zombies were working together to solve complex problems, using primitive tools to overcome barriers, and most disturbing of all, some appeared to be communicating through subtle gestures and movements that suggested a developing language. Her son David had managed to intercept and analyze some of the low-frequency transmissions, discovering that they contained structured information patterns that resembled data packets being transmitted between computer networks. The infected were literally sharing information instantaneously across vast distances, making every zombie encounter a potential intelligence-gathering operation for the collective. Dr. Morrison's research team had made another crucial discovery while analyzing tissue samples from recently killed zombies. The virus was continuing to mutate at an accelerated rate, but the changes weren't random. Instead, they followed patterns that suggested the collective consciousness was actively directing its own evolution, experimenting with new abilities and adaptations in response to human defensive strategies. Some infected were developing enhanced strength and speed, others showed improved problem-solving capabilities, and a few displayed signs of retaining specific memories and skills from their pre-infection lives. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just fighting an army of mindless creatures, but battling an evolving intelligence that was learning and adapting faster than human countermeasures could be developed. The Settlements Council faced an impossible decision as they reviewed the evidence. The central hub in the Metropolitan Hospital represented both their greatest threat and their only hope for victory. If they could destroy it, they might be able to disrupt the entire regional network and return the infected to their original mindless state. But the hub was located in the heart of the most dangerous territory, surrounded by thousands of infected guardians and protected by defensive measures that the collective consciousness had specifically designed to prevent human interference. Any assault would be essentially a suicide mission, requiring a level of coordination and sacrifice that would likely doom most of the participants. As dawn broke over New Haven City, the survivors realized that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Intelligence reports indicated that the zombie collective was preparing for something unprecedented, a coordinated assault that would eliminate the remaining human settlements simultaneously. The infected had learned from their previous encounters and were adapting their tactics to counter human defensive strategies. Time was running out, and the settlement's leaders knew that within days, they would either have to launch their desperate attack on the central hub or watch humanity's last hope disappear forever. The discovery that should have given them hope had instead revealed the true scope of the nightmare they faced, and the terrible price that victory would demand from those brave enough to attempt it. The emergency radio transmission crackled through the communication center at dawn, carrying the desperate voice of Captain Lisa Morgan from the Riverside Settlement, 40 miles north of New Haven City. Her message was grim but determined. Their stronghold was under siege by a coordinated zombie assault, but they had managed to capture crucial intelligence about the infected's attack patterns before their outer defenses were breached. Elena Vasquez worked frantically to establish contact with other survivor enclaves, her equipment pushed to its limits as she attempted to coordinate what might be humanity's final stand. One by one, settlements across the region reported similar situations. They were all facing simultaneous attacks that seemed designed to prevent any possibility of mutual assistance or evacuation. Commander Rodriguez knew that their isolation had become their greatest weakness. For months, the various survivor groups had maintained an uneasy independence, sharing minimal information and resources while focusing on their individual survival. Old rivalries from the world before the outbreak had carried over into the post-apocalyptic landscape, with military remnants distrusting civilian leadership, scientists questioning military tactics, and different communities hoarding supplies that could benefit everyone. The zombie collective's coordinated strategy had exposed the fatal flaw in humanity's fragmented response. They were fighting as scattered tribes against an enemy that had achieved perfect unity. The first convoy of survivors arrived at New Haven City just as the morning sun reached its peak, their vehicles battered and loaded with wounded refugees from the fallen East Side compound. Dr. Patricia Wells, the former CDC researcher who had been leading that settlement's medical efforts, brought with her a collection of research data that complemented Sarah's work in ways that neither scientist had anticipated. Their combined knowledge revealed that the virus mutations were following predictable patterns, suggesting that the collective consciousness might have vulnerabilities that could be exploited if the human settlements could coordinate their efforts effectively. But trust would not come easily between groups that had been competing for resources and territory for months. The tension in the main conference room was palpable as leaders from 6 different settlements gathered for an unprecedented emergency council. Captain Morgan's military background clashed immediately with the civilian leadership approach favored by Dr. Wells and her community representatives. Jake Thompson, representing the construction workers and technical specialists, argued for defensive strategies that would conserve resources, while Maria Santos advocated for aggressive scouting missions that could gather intelligence at great personal risk. The debate grew heated as each group's survival instincts prioritized their own people over collective action, threatening to fracture the alliance before it could truly form. Young David Santos inadvertently provided the catalyst that would unite the fractured groups when he successfully decoded a series of zombie transmissions that revealed the infected's next phase of attack. The collective consciousness wasn't just targeting individual settlements, it was systematically eliminating specific types of survivors who posed the greatest threat to its expansion. Scientists, military leaders, and technical specialists were being prioritized for elimination, suggesting that the infected recognized the importance of human expertise in developing countermeasures. This revelation forced the settlement leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Separated, they were merely postponing the inevitable, but together they might possess the combined knowledge and resources necessary to mount an effective resistance. The alliance began to take shape as pragmatic necessity overcame personal differences. Elena's communication network became the backbone of a coordinated intelligence system, linking the surviving settlements in real time and allowing for rapid response to zombie movements. Dr. Chin and Dr. Wells merged their research efforts, combining their different specializations to accelerate the development of potential weapons against the collective consciousness. Captain Morgan's military experience proved invaluable in developing tactical strategies that could utilize the unique strengths of each settlement's survivors, while Jake's knowledge of infrastructure helped identify strategic locations where a unified human force could establish defensive positions. The first test of their cooperation came when scouts reported a massive zombie horde moving toward the weakest of the Allied settlements. Instead of abandoning the smaller group to save resources, the Alliance committed to a coordinated defense that would either prove their unity or destroy their fragile partnership. Survivors from multiple settlements worked together for the first time, sharing ammunition, medical supplies, and tactical information in a desperate attempt to hold the line against an enemy that had never faced organized human resistance. The battle was brutal and costly, but the humans managed to repel the attack through combined efforts that no single settlement could have achieved alone. As night fell over the exhausted but victorious survivors, the alliance had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle. The diverse groups had learned to trust each other's expertise and commitment, creating a unified command structure that could coordinate resources and strategies across multiple settlements. But their success had come at a price. The zombie collective had also learned from the encounter, and intelligence reports suggested that the infected were already adapting their tactics to counter human cooperation. The alliance had won their first battle, but the war was far from over, and both sides now understood that the ultimate confrontation would require everything they had learned about their enemy and themselves. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as the unified human strike force moved through the abandoned industrial district, their synchronized movements a testament to the intensive training they had undergone in the 3 days since forming their alliance. Commander Rodriguez led the assault team of 40 volunteers, each person selected for their unique skills and unwavering determination to strike the first decisive blow against the zombie collective. Their target was a heavily fortified outpost that intelligence suggested served as a regional communication relay for the infected network. Destroying it could disrupt zombie coordination across a 100-square-mile area and provide crucial data about the collective's operational structure. Maria Santos moved like a ghost through the shadows ahead of the main force, her scouting abilities honed by months of survival in hostile territory. Through her night vision scope, she observed the infected guards with growing unease. Their positioning was too perfect, their patrol patterns too sophisticated for creatures that were supposed to be operating on primitive instincts. The zombies had arranged themselves in overlapping fields of observation that would make any traditional assault nearly impossible, and some appeared to be using hand signals to communicate with each other in ways that suggested retained military training from their previous lives. She radioed back to Rodriguez with the disturbing news that their enemy had evolved far beyond their initial estimates. Dr. Sarah Chen crouched behind a concrete barrier with her portable analysis equipment, studying the electromagnetic signatures emanating from the outpost building. The readings confirmed their worst fears. The structure wasn't just a communication relay but appeared to be some form of biological processing center where the virus was actively modifying infected tissue to create specialized zombie variants. Her equipment detected at least 3 distinct types of infected creatures within the building, each showing different neural activity patterns that suggested they had been optimized for specific combat roles. The collective consciousness was literally manufacturing soldiers designed to counter human tactics, and this outpost was one of many production facilities across the region. The assault began at exactly 0400 hours with Jake Thompson's demolition team creating a precisely timed explosion that collapsed the building's eastern wall while Elena's communication specialists jammed the infected's transmission frequencies. The initial phase went according to plan, with human forces establishing a beachhead within the outpost's perimeter and beginning their systematic advance toward the central processing area. But the zombies' response revealed a level of tactical sophistication that shocked even the experienced military personnel among the strike force. Instead of rushing mindlessly toward the humans, the infected executed a strategic withdrawal that drew the assault team deeper into the building while zombie reinforcements began surrounding the structure from the outside. Captain Morgan's tactical expertise proved invaluable as she recognized the trap before it could be fully sprung. Her radio commands redirected the assault team's advance, preventing them from walking into a carefully prepared ambush where modified zombies with enhanced strength and speed were waiting in concealment. The battle that followed was unlike anything the humans had experienced. Infected creatures that moved with military precision, using coordinated flanking maneuvers and even improvised weapons salvaged from the industrial facility. Some zombies demonstrated problem-solving abilities that allowed them to overcome human defensive positions through creative use of their environment, while others showed evidence of retained professional skills from their pre-infection lives. Dr. Wells worked frantically to analyze tissue samples from the defeated zombies, her field laboratory equipment revealing the horrifying extent of the virus's continued evolution. The infected weren't just maintaining their human knowledge, they were being actively modified by the collective consciousness to enhance their most useful abilities while suppressing aspects of their humanity that might interfere with their effectiveness as soldiers. Engineers retained their technical skills but lost their capacity for independent thought, while former soldiers kept their tactical training but became completely obedient to the collective's directives. The virus was creating a perfect army of specialists, each optimized for their role in the infected hierarchy. The humans succeeded in destroying the outpost, but the victory came at a terrible cost. 12 members of the strike force were killed in the battle, and another 8 were severely wounded, reducing their already limited numbers by nearly half. More disturbing than the casualties was the realization that the zombies had allowed them to win. The infected had gathered valuable intelligence about human tactics and capabilities, sacrificing the outpost to learn how the Alliance operated in combat situations. As the survivors retreated to their base with their wounded and the precious data they had recovered, they understood that their enemy had used the encounter as a training exercise, studying human behavior to develop more effective countermeasures. The debriefing session that followed revealed the true scope of the challenge they faced. The zombie collective was not just intelligent, it was strategic, patient, and willing to accept short-term losses to achieve long-term objectives. Every engagement with the infected provided them with information that would make future encounters more dangerous for human forces. The Alliance had won their first major battle, but in doing so, they had also educated their enemy about their strengths and weaknesses. The war was escalating rapidly, and both sides now understood that the ultimate confrontation would require new levels of sacrifice and innovation. The infiltration team consisted of only 5 volunteers, each chosen for their specific expertise and ability to operate independently in the most dangerous territory on Earth. Maria Santos led the group with her unmatched scouting abilities, accompanied by David Santos, whose technical skills would be crucial for gathering electronic intelligence from deep within zombie-controlled areas. Dr. James Morrison had insisted on joining the mission despite the protests of his colleagues, arguing that his expertise in viral behavior was essential for understanding what they might discover at the Metropolitan Hospital hub. Elena Vasquez brought her communication equipment and linguistic analysis capabilities, while Jake Thompson's knowledge of urban infrastructure could provide escape routes if their mission went wrong. The journey into the city's heart required 3 days of careful movement through territory that had been completely abandoned by human survivors for over 2 months. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about the zombie apocalypse. The infected hadn't simply overrun the urban areas, they had transformed them into something resembling a massive organic machine. Buildings were connected by strange biological growths that pulsed with the same rhythmic patterns they had detected from the central hub, creating a network of living tissue that seemed to serve as both communication channels and nutrient distribution systems for the collective consciousness. Elena's sensitive recording equipment captured sounds that defied explanation, not the mindless moaning typically associated with zombies, but complex vocalizations that followed structured patterns resembling language. Her analysis revealed that the infected were developing their own communication system, one that combined vocal elements with electromagnetic transmissions and even chemical signals released through the biological growths connecting the buildings. The collective consciousness wasn't just coordinating the actions of individual zombies, it was creating an entirely new form of civilization based on principles that humans could barely comprehend. The team's most shocking discovery came when they observed infected creatures engaging in activities that could only be described as research and development. In a converted laboratory facility, zombies with retained scientific knowledge were working systematically to modify the virus itself, experimenting with different combinations of genetic material to create new variants with enhanced capabilities. David's electronic surveillance equipment revealed that these zombie scientists were documenting their work through digital records that were being transmitted to similar facilities in other cities, creating a global network of infectious disease research that operated within human efficiency and completely lacked ethical constraints. Dr. Morrison's worst fears were confirmed when he analyzed tissue samples from the newly created zombie variants. The virus had developed the ability to selectively preserve and enhance specific human traits while eliminating others, creating infected individuals who retained their professional expertise but lost their capacity for independent thought or moral reasoning. The collective consciousness was literally harvesting human knowledge and skills, incorporating them into its expanding network while discarding the aspects of humanity that might resist its control. Even more terrifying was the discovery that the virus was beginning to affect non-infected humans in subtle ways, suggesting that prolonged exposure to the collective's electromagnetic emissions could gradually compromise human mental autonomy. The central hub itself defied description when the team finally reached their observation point overlooking the Metropolitan Hospital. The building had been transformed into a massive biological structure that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own life force. Infected creatures moved in and out of the facility in perfectly coordinated patterns, carrying materials and information that fed the growing intelligence at the structure's core. Most disturbing of all were the partially converted humans, individuals who appeared to be in various stages of transformation, retaining enough of their original personalities to display obvious fear and confusion while being slowly absorbed into the collective consciousness. Elena's equipment detected communication patterns that revealed the scope of the zombie network's expansion plans. The collective consciousness was preparing to launch a coordinated assault on every remaining human settlement simultaneously, but this attack would be different from anything they had faced before. Instead of simply overwhelming human defenses with numbers, the infected planned to use specialized variants designed to counter specific human tactics, while deploying psychological warfare techniques that would break survivors' will to resist. The timeline was accelerating. The final assault would begin within 72 hours, barely enough time for the infiltration team to return with their intelligence. The team's extraction proved even more dangerous than their insertion, as the collective consciousness had detected their presence and was actively hunting them through the city's transformed landscape. They discovered that the biological growths connecting the buildings could detect human presence through chemical signatures, making stealth increasingly difficult as they moved through the urban maze. Only Jake's intimate knowledge of the city's underground infrastructure allowed them to escape through abandoned subway tunnels that the infected had not yet converted to their purposes. As the exhausted team finally reached the safety of the Allied settlements, they carried with them intelligence that would change everything about humanity's final stand. The zombie collective wasn't just an enemy to be defeated, it was an evolving intelligence that was systematically harvesting human civilization to build something entirely new. The survivors had less than 3 days to prepare for an assault that would determine whether humanity would survive as a species or become components in an alien form of consciousness that used human bodies as its raw material. The War Council convened in the pre-dawn hours with a grim determination that permeated the underground bunker where humanity's remaining leaders had gathered to plan what might be their species' final gambit. Commander Rodriguez spread detailed maps across the conference table, marking the locations where diversionary strikes would need to occur simultaneously to draw the zombie collective's attention away from the Metropolitan Hospital hub. The intelligence gathered by the infiltration team had revealed that the infected network operated like a vast immune system. Any significant threat to the central hub would trigger an immediate response that would concentrate defensive forces around the hospital, making a direct assault nearly impossible unless the collective's attention could be divided. Dr. Sarah Chin presented the scientific foundation for their desperate strategy, explaining how the biological growths connecting the city's buildings created a network vulnerability that could be exploited through precisely timed electromagnetic disruptions. Her team had developed portable devices that could temporarily interfere with the collective's communication systems, but each device would require manual activation at specific locations throughout the city, meaning volunteers would need to penetrate deep into zombie territory with no guarantee of survival. The electromagnetic pulse would create a window of confusion lasting perhaps 30 minutes, barely enough time for the strike team to reach the central hub and plant the experimental viral countermeasure that might disrupt the collective consciousness permanently. Captain Morgan outlined the tactical challenges with military precision, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. The diversionary attacks would need to be convincing enough to draw significant zombie forces away from the hospital while maintaining enough strength to survive long enough for the main assault to succeed. Each diversionary team would be operating independently, cut off from communication and support, relying entirely on their training and courage to complete missions that were essentially suicide assignments. The volunteers who stepped forward represented every settlement in the Alliance: teachers, construction workers, medical personnel, and former military members, all united by their determination to give humanity one final chance. Elena Vasquez coordinated the communication plan that would link the scattered human forces during the critical first phase of the operation. Her equipment had been modified to operate on frequencies that the zombie collective couldn't easily detect or jam, but the range was limited and the windows for contact would be brief. Each team would need to operate with near-perfect timing, initiating their attacks within minutes of each other to maximize the confusion created by the electromagnetic disruption. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A single team's failure could compromise the entire operation and doom the strike force attempting to reach the central hub. The emotional weight of the moment became clear as the volunteers said goodbye to their loved ones, knowing that many would never return from their missions. David Santos embraced his mother Maria, both of them understanding that their separate assignments might prevent them from ever seeing each other again. Dr. Wells distributed her remaining medical supplies among the teams, while Jake Thompson provided each group with hand-drawn maps of the city's infrastructure that could provide escape routes if their primary missions succeeded. The bonds forged between the Allied settlements had created a genuine sense of family among the survivors, making the inevitable sacrifices even more painful. The first phase of the operation began at exactly noon when the diversionary teams struck their targets across the city simultaneously. Elena's monitoring equipment showed immediate results as zombie forces began redeploying from the hospital district to respond to the multiple threats. The electromagnetic pulse devices activated in sequence, creating cascading disruptions throughout the biological network that connected the infected city. For the first time since the outbreak began, the zombie collective appeared confused and disorganized, with infected creatures wandering aimlessly as their connection to the central intelligence was temporarily severed. But the collective consciousness adapted faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 20 minutes, the infected network had developed workarounds for the electromagnetic interference, rerouting communication through biological pathways that the human technology couldn't disrupt. The diversionary teams found themselves facing increasingly organized resistance as the zombie forces began to understand that they were dealing with coordinated human deception rather than random attacks. Several teams were overwhelmed before they could complete their missions, their sacrifices buying precious minutes for the main assault but at a terrible cost in human lives. The strike team led by Commander Rodriguez and Dr. Chen fought their way through the hospital's outer defenses as the electromagnetic disruption began to fade. They had reached the building's main entrance, but the collective consciousness was already marshalling its forces for a counterattack that would arrive within minutes. The experimental viral countermeasure was ready for deployment, but reaching the central hub would require fighting through layers of infected defenders who were no longer confused by the electromagnetic interference. The turning point had arrived. Humanity's survival now depended on whether a handful of survivors could penetrate the heart of the zombie collective and deploy their untested weapon before the infected network could crush their final desperate assault. The interior of the Metropolitan Hospital had been transformed into a nightmarish cathedral of flesh and metal, where pulsing biological conduits snaked along the walls like arteries in some impossible organism. Commander Rodriguez led the strike team through corridors that seemed to breathe around them, their footsteps echoing against surfaces that had once been familiar hospital floors but now resembled the inside of a living creature. Dr. Sarah Chen clutched the viral countermeasure device against her chest, its experimental technology representing humanity's last hope against an enemy that had evolved far beyond their original understanding. The team moved with desperate efficiency, knowing that every second brought them closer to the moment when the zombie collective would fully recover from the electromagnetic disruption and turn its complete attention to eliminating the intruders. The first wave of infected defenders emerged from alcoves that had been carved into the hospital's transformed structure, their movements displaying the perfect coordination that characterized the collective consciousness. These weren't ordinary zombies but specialized variants that had been designed specifically to protect the central hub. Some possessed enhanced strength that allowed them to tear through makeshift barricades, while others demonstrated incredible speed and agility that made them nearly impossible to target. Maria Santos moved like a deadly shadow among them, her combat skills honed by months of survival allowing her to eliminate threats with surgical precision while protecting the team's flanks from creatures that attacked with intelligence rather than mindless hunger. Jake Thompson's knowledge of the hospital's original layout proved invaluable as the team navigated through rooms that had been completely restructured by the biological growths spreading throughout the building. His improvised explosives cleared paths through obstacles that would have otherwise required precious minutes to overcome, while his understanding of structural weaknesses allowed the team to create diversions that drew infected reinforcements away from their primary route. Captain Morgan coordinated the team's movements with military precision, her tactical expertise keeping them alive as they fought through increasingly sophisticated defensive positions that the collective consciousness had prepared for exactly this type of intrusion. The central hub itself occupied what had once been the hospital's main surgery suite, but the space had been expanded into a vast chamber where the collective consciousness maintained its physical form. The sight that greeted the strike team defied human comprehension, a massive organic structure that incorporated both infected tissue and salvage technology, pulsing with patterns of light that seemed to represent the thoughts and communications of the entire zombie network. Partially converted humans were integrated into the structure at various points, their faces displaying a mixture of terror and unwilling acceptance as they served as living components in the collective's expanding intelligence. Dr. Chen began the activation sequence for the viral countermeasure while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter around the chamber's entrance. The device would need several minutes to analyze the hub's biological signatures and calibrate its payload for maximum effectiveness, time that they might not have as the collective consciousness began to understand the true nature of the threat they represented. Elena Vasquez worked frantically to maintain communication with the surviving diversionary teams, coordinating their final sacrificial attacks to buy additional precious seconds for the countermeasure deployment. The collective consciousness responded to the invasion with everything it had learned about human psychology and tactics. Instead of simply overwhelming the strike team with infected attackers, it began to use the partially converted humans as psychological weapons, forcing the survivors to confront the faces of people they had known and cared about. The infected network projected voices and memories from the converted individuals, creating a cacophony of pleas for help that tested the team's resolve even as they fought for humanity's survival. Some of the partially converted retained enough of their original personalities to beg for death, while others had been modified to serve as living speakers for the collective's alien intelligence. The countermeasure device reached full activation just as the hospital's defenses were finally overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected reinforcements pouring into the chamber. Commander Rodriguez made the ultimate sacrifice, detonating his remaining explosives to seal the chamber's entrance and by the final seconds needed for the viral weapon to deploy. The device released its payload into the biological network that connected the central hub to the rest of the zombie collective, introducing a specifically designed virus that would theoretically disrupt the electromagnetic patterns that allowed the infected consciousness to maintain its unity. The effect was immediate and devastating. The collective consciousness began to convulse and fragment as the countermeasure spread through its biological network, severing connections between infected individuals and causing the organized zombie forces throughout the city to lose their coordination. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The strike team found themselves trapped in the collapsing hub as the biological structure began to break down around them. The fate of both humanity and the surviving members of the assault team hung in the balance as the central hub's destruction sent shockwaves through the entire infected network, beginning a chain reaction that would determine the ultimate outcome of the war between the living and the dead. The silence that followed the central hub's collapse was unlike anything the survivors had experienced since the outbreak began, a profound quiet that seemed to echo across the entire city as the zombie collective's unified consciousness finally fragmented into thousands of individual, confused minds. Dr. Sarah Chin emerged from the rubble of the Metropolitan Hospital with her team's remaining members, their bodies battered but their spirits lifted by the sight of infected creatures wandering aimlessly through the streets, no longer driven by the malevolent intelligence that had coordinated their every action. The viral countermeasure had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections, severing the biological connections that had transformed humanity's greatest threat into nothing more than scattered groups of disoriented individuals who could be managed through conventional survival techniques. Maria Santos led the rescue efforts to locate survivors from the diversionary teams, her scouting skills now employed in the hopeful task of reuniting families and communities rather than avoiding infected hordes. The electromagnetic monitoring equipment that Elena Vasquez had deployed throughout the city showed a complete cessation of the organized communication patterns that had characterized the zombie collective, replaced by random biological static that indicated the infected network had been permanently disrupted. Jake Thompson worked with engineering teams from the Allied settlements to begin the massive task of clearing the biological growths that had transformed the urban landscape, using controlled demolitions to safely remove the organic structures while preserving the underlying infrastructure that would be essential for rebuilding human civilization. The psychological impact of victory proved almost as challenging as the physical aftermath of the war. Many survivors struggled to accept that the constant threat that had defined their existence for months had finally been eliminated, remaining vigilant for signs of renewed zombie coordination that never materialized. Dr. Wells established counseling programs to help people transition from survival mode to the complex emotional work of grieving their losses while beginning to plan for a future that now seemed possible. The children who had grown up during the outbreak required special attention, having known only a world where infected creatures posed an existential threat to human survival. The scientific implications of their victory opened new frontiers for understanding viral behavior and collective intelligence. Dr. Chen's analysis of the countermeasure's effects revealed that the zombie collective had been more sophisticated than even their worst fears had suggested. The viral network had been actively evolving toward something that could have eventually threatened all biological life on Earth, not just humanity. The successful disruption of this process had implications beyond simply ending the zombie outbreak, potentially providing insights that could prevent similar catastrophic scenarios in the future. Research facilities were established to study the remnants of the biological network, carefully contained to prevent any possibility of the collective consciousness reconstituting itself. The process of rebuilding human civilization required unprecedented cooperation between the former settlement groups, transforming the alliance forged in desperation into a permanent foundation for a new kind of society. The shared trauma and sacrifice of the final battle had created bonds that transcended the old divisions between military and civilian leadership, scientists and practical workers, different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Elena's communication networks evolved into the backbone of a democratic system that allowed all survivor communities to participate in decisions about resource allocation, territorial boundaries, and long-term planning for population recovery. The memorial erected at the site of the former Metropolitan Hospital honored not only those who had died in the final assault but all the people who had been lost during the months of zombie occupation. Commander Rodriguez's sacrifice was commemorated alongside the countless unnamed individuals who had given their lives to preserve the possibility of human survival, creating a sacred space where the living could acknowledge the price that had been paid for their freedom. The memorial's design incorporated elements salvaged from the destroyed biological network, transformed into symbols of hope rather than reminders of horror. David Santos became one of the youngest leaders in the new society, his technical expertise and first-hand experience with the zombie collective's communication systems making him invaluable for developing early warning systems that could detect any resurgence of organized infected activity. His generation would inherit a world marked by the scars of the outbreak but no longer defined by its immediate threat, carrying the responsibility of ensuring that humanity would never again be caught unprepared by such a catastrophic challenge to its survival. As the first anniversary of the final battle approached, the rebuilt communities had established trade networks, educational systems, and cultural institutions that reflected both the hard-won lessons of the outbreak and the enduring human capacity for growth and adaptation. The dawn of tomorrow had arrived not as a return to the world that existed before the zombies, but as the beginning of something entirely new, a civilization that had been tested to its absolute limits and emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The ultimate showdown between humans and zombies had ended not just in victory, but in the rebirth of hope itself.